Hi, and welcome back. My name is Sheldon McLeod. This is Thinking Out Loud. It's presented to you here on the SaltWire Network. And I love having the opportunity to talk to people about stories that may not be perhaps headline news, or maybe it's something that I think has not necessarily gotten the attention that it deserves. And this is something that happened just last week. 4 judges were appointed to provincial court in Nova Scotia, and that was effective February 3rd. Gillian Barrington of Sydney, Bronwyn Duffy of Bible Hill, Jill Hartland of Hubbard's, and Brianna Hatt of New Glasgow. I might not be saying that correctly. Brianna Hatt of New Glasgow. My apologies to Nova Scotia's newest judges. And all 4 women were appointed on the same day. And I wanted to talk about the process that's involved in choosing and selecting judges. In fact, at that Nova Scotia government website, you can scroll down to actually apply if you want to become a judge. Wayne McKay is a professor emeritus at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University. And Wayne, it's so good to see you again. Thank you very much for joining me.
Nice to see you, and Happy New Year. I don't think we've talked since then. So
we have not. So one day in February, 4 women appointed to the judiciary in Nova Scotia. That, to me, would seem like a pretty big deal, a pretty big story.
I think it is a big story, and I think it's a big story in the extent to which we're making progress, significant progress now on getting gender parity in our courts. And it's not that long ago that was far from the case, but over time we've moved more and more towards that. But this is the first time in my memory that 4 women have been appointed at one time. May not be the very first time, but it's the first one I know about.
Maybe that's the true sign of progress. It wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a story. It wasn't a top news story of the day. Maybe that's a sign that we're starting to see it less. The gender matters less, but it's the character of the people being appointed that matters.
Absolutely. And I think a couple of important points there. I think it is a positive comment that we don't make such a big deal about that. If this had happened, let's say 30, even 20, even 10 years ago, there would almost certainly be a large comment, but we're reaching a point, not there yet, where we're getting closer to gender parity. In fact, on the provincial court itself, there is now gender parity. And in fact, I did a little research on this, and I think they actually reached something like 51% or something in 2017. So that they have reached that a little bit earlier, but that's a significant change. Not that long ago, most of the people on the benches in Nova Scotia, as elsewhere, were men, and by and large white men. So that almost exclusively white men, not entirely exclusively, but pretty close.
And we know that there were a number of retirements announced over the last several months, and I suspect these vacancies obviously are why we have these new appointments. Is the judiciary the same as the Senate? Is there an upper age limit?
It's not so much an age limit. I did a little background work on looking at the criteria for appointment and the structure for setting it up, which we might want to talk a little bit about, because that may explain why we're making this progress in part. But there's no real age requirement at the front end. At the end, there is a retirement suggested or normal retirement age, but judges can go into what's called a supernumerary status in the sort of post-retirement mode. So that can last for a while as well. But I think one of the things, when you looked at the pictures in these very impressive young women that just got appointed, not only is it women, but by and large, pretty young women by traditional standards, although again, that's been a moving target. More and more judges now are appointed at a younger age and sometimes retire at a younger age, not always, but sometimes. And that's a change as well. So I think that's a development. One requirement in the criteria is that you do have to have a minimum of 10 years as a member of the Nova Scotia Bar before being eligible to be appointed to the bench. And that's true at the higher level courts as well, but it's true at provincial court. It used to be 15 years, and that partly explains the age point. It used to be 15 years until that was amended in 2016. And we've had relatively clear guidelines and criteria since 1995. So
And coincidentally, today the provincial government announced, the Justice Department announced, lawyers who have been given the KC or King's Counsel designation, and in the criteria there it says you have to have been a member of the bar for 15 years. So it takes more time to become KC than it does to become a judge now.
Exactly. And that would be more in line with the older rules of 15 years as well. And as I say, I won't get into that right now. We might want to go elsewhere, but at some point it's useful to think about the process about how these people get appointed, because that traditionally has not been very transparent and still is fairly clouded, but it's much better than it used to be. And as recently as January a year ago, 2022, they made some further changes to the structure for appointing these kind of judges as well.
So much of what we think we know about the legal system comes via television, and in many cases that's U.S. television. It's an entirely different process there, but there's always been this Canadian idea, or the UK tradition, of not having politics involved with that branch of government. So what can you tell us about how someone becomes a judge in 2023?
Well, and building on what you just said, first of all, under the constitutional structure, it's still very much a British parliamentary structure that judges are appointed by the governor in council, which means at a provincial level, like these provincial appointments, the lieutenant governor, on the advice of cabinet or the council, actually make the appointments. So that's still pretty top down and hierarchical. But as of at least 1995, the real critical decisions are now made at a provincial advisory committee. And the provincial advisory committee is made up of some judges, some lawyers, and at least two, can be more, members from the general public. And each of those people appointed to that committee by the justice, but recommended to them either from the Bar Society or the courts. So there's quite a lot more diversity and more sort of a range of opinions than used to be the case, where it used to be all pretty well within the political domain, not like the US, where it's so clearly political and they don't even attempt to hide that in any way. But historically, appointments in Canada and Nova Scotia as well used to be quite political, that if you weren't fairly well connected to the party in power, you weren't going to be appointed as a judge. That's pretty well a given. And we had a number of cases where former attorney generals were appointed as judges, or former senators that might be appointed as judges. That still can happen, but not because of politics, but because of other factors. So it's gotten a lot more open and a lot more diverse than it used to be.
This may seem like a fairly simple question, but when a judge is chosen, do they have to balance out, because a provincial court judge is responsible for criminal affairs as well as for family court? Do people choose to specialize in an area, perhaps?
In the fairly detailed applications for appointment, and that's a newer thing as well, that in recent years now, lawyers apply to be a judge, where it used to be they couldn't really apply. They would be nominated by somebody, or the relevant political authorities would ask them whatever. Now you do apply. And in that, they would indicate areas of expertise. And as it should be, the number one criteria is still merit, that it's really about the merit of the person at a legal level in terms of accomplishment and knowledge of the law. And in that category, I think they certainly could take account of their needs. If there were more needs in the family side of things, and the particular candidate offered that experience, then that would make them more suitable than somebody in the criminal area at that point, where they had perhaps all the people they needed. So that's one factor, but not the only, although they do emphasize that, as it should be, merit is the number one criteria.
Judges don't grant interviews, or on very rare occasion do we ever really get to know the people once they are appointed to the bench. And I'm wondering how, in this age of information, how that sits. Is this something that still makes sense given how things change and things evolve?
I think it does. Now, I'm undoubtedly biased, having been brought up in the British Canadian tradition of lawyering and judging and so on. But I think that the extent to which we do separate the judicial branch from the political branch is really important. And that having that kind of distance, that they are important figures who make very significant decisions in our political life, but they're not politicians. And their accountability is really to the law, not to the broader public, that I think it is important to keep that kind of distinction. Now, the courts, again, have made some adjustments so that most every level of court now has representatives or people employed to be the media contact, and but judges themselves don't do interviews in the way they would. I mean, an issue like this, I think I saw in the paper the other day that U.S. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas did not attend Biden's speech, address to the nation the other night, and that was announced. Well, that would never be a point of political comment in Canada, whether or not a judge did or did not attend. And in fact, if they did attend, we'd almost be somewhat suspicious that that was a little too political for a judge to be doing. But in the U.S., they make a deal of saying he did not attend.
Right.
It's kind of interesting.
And for folks who may have a cursory knowledge, we're talking provincial court judges, and then there's the Nova Scotia Supreme Court justices. And is that a similar process for appointment?
It is a very similar process. The major difference for people who, and that would be most Nova Scotians who don't know this, the provincial court is a provincial appointment. So technically under the Constitution, the lieutenant governor, and in real terms by the cabinet of the provincial legislature, the premier and the cabinet. The Supreme Court and Court of Appeal appointments are federal appointments, so that the key players are the Governor General, advised by the cabinet. So the Prime Minister and the federal cabinet are making those appointments, but very, not identical, but very similar kinds of advisory committees and structures that now emphasize a wider range of criteria, especially on diversity, and sort of circling back to where we started with this being 4 women appointees, that's a newer criteria that is in there, still not above merit, not above many other things. But one of the things they look at is the diversity and the representation, if you like, to some extent on the bench. So they've moved pretty far in relation to gender parity, not very far on Indigenous representation or racial minority and other kinds of diversity. And there's still some debate about that. But in both the Supreme Court and the provincial court level, there is now some significant attention paid to that.
How often are prosecutors appointed to the bench in that way?
Fairly frequently, especially in criminal law, because obviously they would have that would be their main exposure if they were lifelong prosecutors. So that's a question as well where you might look at some balance in terms of how many defense lawyers, how many prosecutors do you have on the bench, and sort of there's a constant effort to balance many things. Geography, another important part in both of those is how representative are the judges of the different parts of the province and the provincial court level. And so even little important criteria, for example, the provincial court, somewhat like the Supreme Court trial division, can move throughout the province. And one of the criteria is that the person should be in a reasonable commutable distance to the court they're being assigned to. So practical things like that. Another one, just when I was looking through some of this, which I thought was kind of interesting, they have a number of, in addition to professional qualifications, personal qualifications in terms of moral courage and communication skills and writing and those kind of things, which obviously makes sense. One that struck me as interesting was that they should not have a noticeable tendency towards pomposity or authoritarian tendencies, right in the criteria, which is rather interesting. And on the more positive side of that, that one of the personal characteristics that they looked at was politeness and respecting other people. When you think about that, it kind of makes sense, but we don't necessarily think about those criteria. You think of a judge, well, as long as they know the law, that's the key. And that still is extremely important, but they are now looking at other things as well.
I've been in the media and news world for long enough to know characters, I'll call them characters like Hiram Carver or Joseph Kennedy. And I don't know that people like that would necessarily grow and develop in the system like they had in the past. I think it's a different time. And clearly this is a turning of the page to have 4 women appointed as judges all in one day. So I don't know if you had any stories or comment about those 2 individuals I mentioned in particular.
Well, certainly they were both very interesting characters with very interesting backgrounds, quite apart from the judicial world. And in some ways, they would, at least particularly former Justice, or I guess still Justice Kennedy, had a very diverse background, an amazing comedian, as you would probably know, and speaker and all those kind of things, but had in some ways the mix of personal traits and legal traits that would make him qualified. What would be a little different about either of those people you mentioned would be, well, white males are still certainly eligible and should be based on merit like everybody else. There is an increasing focus on addressing the lack of representative nature on the courts so that it's, as we talked about earlier, not as surprising to have 4 women appointments, because we're still just getting to a 50%. And I did a little look. I don't think that we're still quite at 50% on the Supreme Court trial division, pretty close to it on the Court of Appeal. So we're getting closer there, but still not there. And when we take that diversity further afield to Indigenous, racial minority, ethno groups and things like that, we're not there at all. Or when you look at questions of disability or other kinds of things, we aren't as diverse. And I should add that there's a big debate about that. The court, unlike the legislature, isn't primarily representative, right? It doesn't have to be accountable to the people and fully representative. And some would still argue that shouldn't even be a factor. But increasingly, they do now say it should be. That it's one factor, not the key one, not the only one by any means, but one factor is how representative is the court itself. And one way that they've tried to address that is to have these advisory committees, which also then need to be diverse in terms of who are the public representatives or who are the lawyer or judge representatives. Is the committee that recommends to the minister itself diverse? So we're getting there.
And I think I've asked of you before for comment on the lack of the lack of lawyers running for political office. Maybe that's a conversation for another time. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the William Sanderson trial once it concludes. There's some complexities there that I don't want to wade into right now at the risk of having somebody call my boss or a judge admonishing us for talking about something we shouldn't.
Well, but let me just make one interesting observation connected to today's topic on that. In reading the paper, I was noticing that in the Sanderson trial, both prosecutors are relatively young women. The defense lawyer is a young woman, so the judge is male. But it's a jury trial, but all 3 of the lawyers in this high-profile, very important case are women, which does kind of a link to our story that there's an increasing number of very qualified women. And I've seen that in my years as a law professor over the years. And the membership in the classes now are, if anything, predominantly women, or, at least at equal numbers, which didn't used to be the case. So there's a significant pool of qualified women, including the 4 that have just been appointed to the provincial court. So I think that's, in that sense, we do connect to the Sanderson trial.
And I believe it was 6 men, 6 women remaining on the jury. So there we go.
Exactly.
Wayne McKay, Professor Emeritus, the Schulich School of Law. Always great to catch up with you and to pick your brain about these things that I think about from time to time. So thank you for this.
No problem. Always a pleasure.